When Karen, the HOA tyrant, smashed my mailbox for the fourth time, I didn't just replace it, I built a trap. Watch how one man's stand against petty suburban rules sparked a neighborhood rebellion. It started with a single swing of a bat that shattered more than just metal. It ignited a suburban war I never saw coming. It was 6:03 a.m. on a Tuesday when the sound of metal bending under a bat jolted me out of a dream where I was finally left alone. I raced to the window in my boxers, coffee still brewing, and there she was again. Karen, the self-declared queen of the HOA. Standing smugly beside the remains of my brand new mailbox like it was some kind of suburban execution. Her little yappy dog barked like a demon at the crumpled aluminum, as if celebrating the kill. And just like every other time, she strutted back across the street in that ridiculous pink tracksuit, twirling the bat like it was a baton and not a felony. The nerve, the audacity. This wasn't just vandalism anymore. This was a Cold War, and I was done playing diplomat. See, this wasn't the first time she'd smashed my mailbox. This was mailbox number 4. The first had been plain, the second reinforced, the third hidden behind a bush. But Karen, oh, Karen, had radar for pettiness. And with each one she destroyed, I found myself waking earlier, listening for the thump of a bat, staring at my tools with darker thoughts. You'd think someone would stop her, but Karen was the HOA president, which in this town might as well mean sheriff, judge, and executioner. People feared her more than raccoons feared porch lights. Nobody dared cross her because she fined them for grass height, mailbox design, holiday lights left up too long, even for letting kids draw with sidewalk chalk. And if you thought she'd stop there, you haven't met Karen in full bloom. When I moved into this neighborhood 6 months ago, I was a hopeful ex-mechanic with plans to convert the garage into a custom parts workshop and enjoy a quiet life sipping tea while listening to jazz. I paid my dues, mowed my lawn, introduced myself to neighbors, and tried to mind my business. But Karen didn't like people who minded their business. She liked control, and I think it drove her absolutely insane that I didn't beg for her approval. That first week, she left a typed note in my mailbox saying it didn't conform to HOA aesthetics. I replaced it with one from Home Depot. Then another note came. This one in all caps, warning me that my choice of charcoal paint suggested a rebellious tone. Then came the bat. At first, I thought it was some neighborhood kid. I even shrugged it off, bought another, and went on. But when I installed a small camera and it was mysteriously unplugged the same day, I knew I was dealing with someone not only bold but deeply bored. It was my neighbor Sheila, a soft-spoken widow who finally cracked. After too many HOA notices about her azalea bushes, who quietly confirmed it. Over tea one day. Karen, she whispered, had been bragging during wine night that she taught the new guy a lesson. Apparently, I was the new guy, so I played it smart. I didn't confront horror. I went quiet, replaced the mailbox again, but this time with a box made of concrete painted to match the house, and most importantly, embedded with a micro camera the size of a pea and a Wi-Fi uplink. It wasn't just a mailbox anymore. It was a trap. I even left a note on the front of it that said, "Smile" in big friendly letters. I didn't lock the gate yet. That would come next. No, first I needed her on record. 2 days later, like some unholy postal Groundhog Day, she came again. This time wearing sunglasses and a scarf. Like she was trying out for the worst spy movie ever made. She raised the bat and paused, then leaned in, squinting at the mailbox like it was mocking her. She read the note. I watched on my phone. Live as confusion turned to fury. She swung anyway. The bat bounced. She swung again. The bat cracked. She swore like a sailor and stormed off holding her wrist. Beautiful. I uploaded the footage to a private drive. I wasn't ready to go public yet. Not until I was armed with more than one incident. See, people like Karen don't just ruin one mailbox. They ruin lives in little increments. My neighbors were living in fear of her clipboards and citations. One guy got fined because his trash bin was visible for 12 minutes after pickup. Another got a warning letter because his daughter's lemonade stand had a sign written in marker instead of printed ink. The neighborhood was a simmering pressure cooker and Karen was holding the lid. And she thought I'd be the next to steam, but I've dealt with engines that explode without warning. I know when to vent, so I started laying brick for a small front gate. Nothing dramatic, just decorative at first. Something to enhance curb appeal. I even cited HOA approved fencing standards in my paperwork. Karen came by during construction, arms crossed, sunglasses reflecting the hot sun, and said, gates must remain open during daylight hours. I smiled and said, of course, wouldn't dream of breaking the rules. That weekend, I made the final tweak. The mailbox was fortified. The camera system was upgraded to motion capture and the gate, the gate now had a lock, a silent one, and a motor. I could control it from my phone. I wasn't just protecting my property anymore. I was building a perimeter around my sanity. That Sunday, Karen's SUV was parked partially on my grass again. She did it every week, claiming visitor overflow, even though the street was empty. I waited, and at exactly 10:12 a.m. she walked across my yard, paused at the mailbox like she couldn't resist, then walked away. I closed the gate. From my window, I watched her try to walk back to her car and freeze. There was a 6-foot fence now between her and her vehicle. A fence that wrapped around the property line with a gate locked tight. She tried pushing it. Nothing. Tried yelling. I waved. She pulled out her phone. I leaned back in my chair and watched the show unfold. When the police arrived, she played the victim like a soap opera star mid-divorce. Claimed she was being held hostage, that I trapped her, that I was a violent veteran with a mailbox obsession. The officer, young and clearly amused, asked to see my footage. I handed him the tablet. He watched, he laughed. He turned to her and said, "Ma'am, you broke his mailbox 4 times. She went pale, then red, then a curious purple. She screamed at me as they escorted her back across the fence. I promised to unlock the gate the next day. I didn't, not yet. Her car sat there like a trophy, and from that moment, everything changed. The neighborhood that once whispered Karen's name in fear began to smile again. And I sat on my porch with a lemonade and waited, because I knew deep in her bones Karen wasn't done. Not even close. And neither was I. The sun rose the next morning to find Karen's prized luxury SUV still fenced in like a wild animal trapped in a suburban zoo exhibit, perfectly centered on the crushed portion of my front lawn, where she had always insisted she had a legal right to park. I sipped my coffee, slowly enjoying the rare quiet that had settled over the neighborhood. No clipboard tapping, no dog barking, no HOA screeches echoing across manicured lawns. The peace was unnatural, like the eye of a hurricane. And sure enough, before I could finish my second sip, Karen emerged from her house across the street, wearing a blazer and sunglasses like she was headed to a courtroom drama. She marched straight to the fence line, stared at her car, and shouted my name as if I were a dog that had just peed on her hydrangeas. I answered the call by waving gently and saying, as polite as I could manage, that she had 30 days to remove the vehicle from my property before I'd start charging storage fees, just like any impound lot would. Her face twisted like she'd bitten into a lemon. She yelled something about easement rights, and I responded by calmly pulling out a file folder labeled Karen Defense Protocol and flipping through the tabs until I reached the deed. There it was in black and white. Any easement the HOA had once granted for shared parking expired 6 years ago and was never renewed. The property line now included that patch of grass her tires loved so much. I even had the county clerk's email printed and stapled to the back. Her only reply was a screech that could make drywall peel. By mid-afternoon, Karen had assembled a small team of allies, mostly the few remaining board members too afraid or too bored to question her rule. They stood on the sidewalk whispering like middle schoolers plotting a prank, pointing at my fence, my mailbox, my life. I took a break from trimming my hedge just long enough to hear her hiss. "Well, see what code enforcement says." I smiled because that was exactly what I wanted. Let them come. Let them measure and inspect and question every nail. Because while Karen had spent years enforcing arbitrary rules based on whims and grudges, I had spent the past month reading the HOA charter like it was scripture. I knew every clause, every loophole, every outdated ordinance that she conveniently ignored when it suited her. I knew the precise height limit for fences, the required setback from sidewalks, and the permitted mailbox materials. And most importantly, I knew the law. She didn't. Or maybe she just thought it didn't apply to her. 3 days later, a white city vehicle pulled up and out stepped a bored-looking code enforcement officer with a clipboard and a bag of gas station peanuts. He introduced himself, asked politely if he could take a look around, and I welcomed him with iced tea and a printed list of all my recent modifications, complete with corresponding code references and HOA rule numbers. He raised his eyebrows, not used to this kind of preparation. Karen followed close behind, practically vibrating with anticipation, until he turned to her and asked why her vehicle was on someone else's property. She stammered something about a shared tradition, and he nodded, like he'd heard every excuse in the book and was tired of them all. He walked the perimeter of the fence, measured twice, took photos of the mailbox, the lawn, even the little solar lights I'd added for ambience. Then he thanked me, said everything looked not only legal, but well executed, and turned to Karen to say she'd be receiving a notice for vehicle abandonment if she didn't move the car within 5 days. She gasped like he'd slapped her, then stomped off in silence. For the first time since I'd moved in that evening, under cover of darkness, she attempted her first real counterattack. I was in the garage cleaning wrenches when I heard a metallic clink followed by hurried footsteps. I checked the camera feed. Karen had tried to sneak through the back fence gate, thinking maybe she could at least retrieve something from her car, but the gate was locked and the motion sensors activated the spotlight, bathing her in LED brightness. She froze, then turned to look straight into the camera lens with the same horror movie expression people make when they realize the call is coming from inside the house. I activated the speaker and casually said, "Hi, Karen. Need something?" She bolted like a raccoon caught in a dumpster, knocking over one of her own HOA yard signs in the process. 2 days later, I got a certified letter on heavy cardstock that looked like it belonged in a wedding invitation box. It was from the HOA, signed by Karen herself, demanding I remove the mailbox immediately under the pretense that its concrete structure constituted a safety hazard to delivery personnel. I laughed so hard I choked on my sandwich. The same woman who had personally destroyed multiple mailboxes with a bat was now suddenly concerned about the well-being of mail carriers. I called my lawyer, a retired bulldog of a woman named Rita, who lived 2 blocks over and had sued the HOA 3 times.
Already in one.
She read the letter, chuckled darkly, and said she'd handle it. The next day, she hand-delivered a cease and desist letter to Karen's porch, watched her open it through binoculars from her own lawn chair and waved like a queen as Karen crumpled it
in frustration.
But the real show began at the next HOA meeting. Normally, these things were ghost towns. 5 people gathered around a folding table pretending to care about pool filter budgets and holiday light guidelines. But that night, word had spread. Half the neighborhood showed up, some with lawn chairs, snacks, even popcorn.
Karen
strutted in with her usual arrogance, only to find the room buzzing with whispers and side eyes. Rita took the floor with a stack of printed evidence taller than Karen's ego. She outlined every violation Karen had committed, from forged meeting minutes to petty fines to unauthorized spending on what she called personal comfort items, including a $300 heated garden bench and 14 shipments of wine-labeled office supplies. People gasped. Phones came out. A retired schoolteacher from 2 doors down stood up and shouted, "She fined me for planting marigolds." It was chaos. Beautiful, liberating chaos. By the time the motion was called, the vote was unanimous. Karen was ousted as HOA president and replaced by a quiet neighbor named Bruce, who immediately promised to restore sanity and let people grow their damn marigolds. Karen stormed out, muttering threats, but the damage was done. The spell was broken. She no longer had the power of the clipboard, the fines, or the bylaws. She was just another neighbor now. A very angry, very exposed one. I knew she wouldn't go quietly, though. People like Karen never do. They simmer. They scheme. They come back uglier than ever. But I had something she never expected. Momentum. For the first time since moving in, the neighborhood was behind me. People waved now, smiled, offered help. One guy brought me ribs. Another offered to repaint my fence. Even the quiet ones, the ones she'd intimidated for years, started speaking up. The balance had shifted, and as I stood on my porch that night, watching the moonlight glint off the chrome of her still-trapped SUV, I realized the war wasn't over. But the battle lines were redrawn, and I had the high ground now. It was a quiet Saturday morning, the kind where the sun filters gently through the trees, and the world feels like it might actually give you a break. But in my yard sat a glaring monument to unresolved chaos. A luxury SUV parked on my grass, surrounded by fencing, motion sensors, and a petty little victory that was still fresh and humming. Karen hadn't dared set foot on my property again. But her car remained like a monument to her audacity, immovable and obnoxiously pearlescent, its presence both a trophy and a loaded spring. I knew she wouldn't let it go. She was far too proud to ask for help and far too angry to face reality. So, she played the waiting game, hoping maybe I'd get bored and open the gate. But I didn't get bored. I got strategic. That morning, I installed a lock on the gate with a timer, one that only I controlled from my phone, just in case she tried anything weird like sneaking in while I was out grabbing milk. The fence itself had become a symbol to the neighborhood. Now I could feel it every time someone walked their dog by and slowed to stare. I'd become the accidental folk hero of the block. The man who finally put the HOA dragon in a cage. And while I didn't ask for the title, I didn't mind the reverence either. But as every story goes, the hero always gets tested again. Karen came to test me just after noon, dressed in her usual passive-aggressive armor, oversized sunglasses, a floppy sun hat, and a clipboard that no longer held any actual power, but seemed to bring her psychological comfort. She Approached the fence and in her most saccharine voice yet, said she just needed to retrieve an item from the car. I told her politely but firmly that she'd have to submit a written request through my newly formed one-man vehicle impound department, then added almost kindly that she could have her car back anytime she paid a $50 a day storage fee backdated to the day she parked it. She sputtered, twitched, then stormed off yelling something about legal action, which made me laugh harder than it should have. I knew the law, and more importantly, I had all the receipts. 2 hours later, the police arrived again. Different officers this time, older and less amused, but still professional. Karen stood next to them like a child, pointing at a sibling, hoping the grown-ups would finally punish me. I greeted them calmly, provided the same documentation as before, and added an updated folder with itemized storage charges and a detailed timeline of events. One of the officers flipped through it and mumbled, "This is more organized than our evidence locker," before nodding and walking back to Karen. She yelled something incoherent about trespassing, emotional trauma, and neighborhood harassment, but they just advised her to seek civil court action if she felt wronged and then left. The look on her face when they drove away was a mix of disbelief and fury, like someone who had always counted on their tantrums to work and was now discovering that the world had changed. But the next day, things got weirder. I caught her pacing in front of the fence at sunrise, murmuring to herself and tapping on her phone with the intensity of someone plotting a hostile takeover. Later that afternoon, I noticed her SUV had a pink note stuck to the windshield. Curious, I checked the footage and saw her sneaking up, trying to wedge some kind of letter under the wiper from outside the fence using a stick. It was like watching someone try to feed a tiger through a zoo enclosure using spaghetti. I retrieved the note later with gloves and tongs just in case she'd laced it with poison ivy or something. The letter was written in loopy cursive on floral stationery and full of the most bizarre mixture of apology and threats I'd ever seen. It started with, "Dear neighbor, I regret that things have gotten so out of hand," and ended with, "But I will not be made to look like a criminal when I have served this community for over a decade and maintained its standards with pride. So, I expect my vehicle returned within 48 hours, or I will take action." It was the kind of note that tries to sound noble but drips with entitlement. I framed it and hung it above my tool bench for inspiration. Later that week, Bruce, the new HOA president, came by. He knocked on my door with a cooler of lemonade and a sheepish smile. We talked in the driveway while the sun dipped behind the trees. He said he'd gotten 6 different complaints from Karen in 3 days, all worded like legal documents, but with a disturbing number of all caps, sentences, and underlines. He'd even gotten a letter accusing him of being in league with mailbox anarchists. We both laughed until we wheezed. Bruce said he just wanted to make sure I wasn't planning to press any further action, and I assured him that my only plan was to enjoy my property, my peace, and my rapidly growing tomato plants. He said if Karen escalated again, he'd bring it to the HOA legal team, which to be fair was just a retired librarian named Donna, who hated confrontation. Still, it was nice to know the tides had truly shifted. But of course, Karen wasn't done. That Friday, I found a large box on my porch with no return address. Inside were a pair of bolt cutters, a passive-aggressive note that read, "Let's not make this any harder than it has to be," and a poorly photoshopped image of me behind bars with the caption, "Coming soon." I laughed so hard I nearly dropped my coffee. I called Rita, my lawyer, and she said in her deadpan way, "Keep it. We'll use it as evidence." We added it to the growing file of petty intimidation attempts, now thick enough to slap someone with. That night, I slept well, dreaming of an HOA world where mailboxes bloomed like flowers and people watered their lawns with wine. Then came the incident with the koi pond. It was early evening and I was out back adjusting the pond filter when I heard a scraping sound.
I checked the camera feed and saw Karen trying to scale the side fence, clearly aiming to
cut through my yard to reach her car.
She'd brought a stepladder and everything.
But she hadn't accounted for the fact that I'd recently coated the top rail with a slick anti-climb paint, legal and HOA approved. As she swung her leg over the top, her foot slipped and she tumbled down, landing with a splash
right in the koi pond.
There was a moment of silence where even the birds seemed to hold their breath.
Then came
the shriek. It was a sound so pure, so utterly humiliated that I almost felt
bad.
Almost. She stood soaked to the bone, koi darting away from her flailing limbs, and screamed something about lawsuits and safety hazards and biocontamination. I stepped into view and asked calmly if she needed a towel or maybe a moment to reconsider all her life choices. She hurled a decorative garden gnome at me and stormed out the side gate, which ironically wasn't even locked.
By the
next morning, footage of the koi pond incident had made it to the neighborhood group chat.
Someone had screen recorded it and added dramatic music. By lunchtime, it was a meme. Koi Karen,
they called her now. Even kids were reenacting her fall in slow motion with
sound effects. Karen, once feared as the unshakable tyrant of the block, was now a punchline.
And her SUV still sat in my yard, untouched, pristine, and gloriously fenced in like the world's most satisfying sculpture. For the first time since I moved in, I felt light.
The war wasn't over. Not yet.
But for now, the scoreboard read one Karen soaking
wet. The morning after the koi pond incident, the neighborhood was buzzing with a rare kind of electricity, the
sort usually reserved for presidential scandals or surprise flash sales at the
local Costco. People weren't just whispering about Karen anymore. They were openly laughing.
Lawn chairs were placed a little closer to the sidewalk than usual. Conversations were held just a little louder, and a few houses even played dramatic orchestral music whenever someone walked by the scene of the fall. Her reputation, once armored in fear and HOA authority, had cracked in front of a live audience, and the fractures were spreading faster than she could patch them. But Karen, in her delusion, believed this storm could
still be weathered. I knew better. Narcissists like her didn't surrender.
They escalated, and sure enough, just as I was settling into the idea of a quiet afternoon trimming hedges, I found a fresh letter stuffed under my garage door.
It wasn't in an envelope, wasn't
addressed to anyone in particular, and it reeked of drugstore perfume and rage. It was a memo, apparently from the HOA, though with Karen's name scribbled in massive red letters at the top like a child's school project. And it claimed that due to recent incidents of visual discord and architectural aggression, my mailbox now posed a community safety risk and had been deemed non-compliant with emergency design standards.
It was so absurd I had to sit down.
According to her hastily stapled document, I was ordered to remove the mailbox within 72 hours or face weekly fines and possible
lien actions.
I laughed so loud my neighbor across the street leaned out of his door and shouted, "What did she do
now?"
I waved the paper in the air and yelled back, "She's trying to outlaw concrete."
I immediately scanned the letter, highlighted every legal flaw in bright yellow, and emailed it to Rita, who called me laughing before she'd even reached the second paragraph. She told me to sit tight, not respond, and that she'd take care of it the old-fashioned way. I wasn't entirely sure what that meant, but I trusted her instincts. That same afternoon, Rita arrived in person. Wearing a sun hat and aviator glasses, the closest thing she had to battle gear, and she marched right over to Karen's house with a yellow legal pad and 3 witnesses in tow. I watched from my window as Karen opened the door, tried to slam it, got blocked by Rita's orthopedic shoe, and ended up backing into her own living room like she'd been raided.
I didn't hear what was said, but I saw the moment Karen realized she was outgunned. Her face lost all color, her mouth opened and closed like a broken garage door, and she finally shut the door with the slow motion of someone realizing they just lost the final round. By the next day, Rita had filed a formal complaint with the county, not just about the fraudulent memo, but about Karen's continued abuse of her former position, misuse of HOA letterhead, and unauthorized attempts at code enforcement. Bruce, the new HOA president, issued an emergency meeting notice and hand-delivered it to every mailbox on the street, every intact one. Anyway, that night, the community center was packed. I hadn't seen so many neighbors in one place since the 4th of July parade that ended with the mayor stuck in a porta-potty. People came not just out of curiosity, but because they finally had a cause. Karen arrived last. Dramatically late and dressed like she was attending her own coronation, complete with a pearl necklace and a folder stuffed with what she clearly thought were irrefutable documents. Bruce took the podium, cleared his throat, and began reading from a printed timeline of her antics going back 2 years. Every mailbox complaint, every fine, every accusation of unruly curb appeal and aggressive lawn ornaments was read aloud. The room gasped, then chuckled, then erupted into laughter when Bruce revealed that she had charged the HOA budget for a personal aroma therapy diffuser labeled as wellness infrastructure. Karen stood up mid-sentence and tried to shout over him, but the room had turned. People who had once been her silent supporters now openly questioned her. "Why did you find my son for sidewalk chalk?" one father shouted. "You wrote me up for having a garden gnome," an elderly woman added. "You said my toddler's tricycle was a safety hazard," someone else yelled. Karen tried to regain control, waving her folder like a sword, but it was too late. Bruce calmly asked for a vote. Hands shot up faster than anyone expected. Unanimous, Karen was banned from ever holding any HOA office or participating in committee decisions again. She stood there frozen, lips trembling, and then stormed out without a word, her heels echoing like gunshots across the tile floor. The next morning, a local real estate newsletter published a short column titled, "Neighborhood Karen Knocked Off HOA Throne," and I couldn't help but frame it and hang it beside the framed letter from her mailbox ban. But just because she was removed didn't mean she was finished. That became clear when 2 nights later, my motion camera triggered at 1:14 a.m. and captured a blurry figure lurching across my yard holding what looked suspiciously like a crowbar. The figure approached the mailbox, swung once, and was immediately blinded by floodlights, hit with a loud pre-recorded message that yelled, "Step away from the mailbox," and doused by the automatic sprinkler system I'd rerouted to spray intruders. The figure slipped, fell into the flower bed, then scrambled to her feet and vanished into the darkness. The next day, I filed a police report with the footage and added it to the now infamous Karen folder, which had become so large I had to keep it in its own drawer. The responding officer chuckled, shook his head, and said, "Man, she really hates that mailbox, huh?" The community's sympathy for Karen was gone. She was now just an angry neighbor, stripped of power, reputation, and even access to her own car, which still sat fenced on my lawn like a forgotten relic. At this point, it was costing her over $600 in accumulated storage fees. I even printed an invoice and mailed it to her through the mailbox she'd once tried to obliterate. Irony didn't get sweeter than that. Karen, of course, didn't pay. Instead, she tried to list the car as stolen. The officer who responded, the same one who'd laughed at the footage, returned to her house, looked at her, then at me, then back at her and said, "You do know you can't report something as stolen when it's sitting in plain view, and you left it there voluntarily, right?" She exploded, accusing the
Entire police department of bias, corruption, and anti-HOA sentiment. 2. Which the officer simply replied, "Ma'am, it's not an HOA anymore. It's just a neighborhood now." Still, I wasn't done. With the full support of the new HOA board, I submitted a petition to convert the small grassy lot that Karen always claimed for overflow parking into a neighborhood garden. The vote passed with record speed. Within days, people began digging, planting, contributing bricks and benches, turning the once contentious patch of land into something beautiful. Karen watched from her window, seething as her SUV slowly became surrounded by rose bushes, tomato plants, and a decorative archway bearing the words "Community Roots." The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. What had once been her territory of domination was now a sanctuary of cooperation. It was almost poetic how quickly the neighborhood transformed once Karen lost her grip on it. Where fear had once tiptoed behind trimmed hedges and silence lived between picket fences, now there was laughter, porch conversations, and kids on scooters decorating driveways with chalk masterpieces no one dared erase. The community garden bloomed around her marooned SUV like vines overtaking a forgotten monument. And every new sprout felt like another nail in the coffin of her influence. But if Karen was anything, she was stubborn. And the sight of her status crumbling beneath tomato vines and lavender bushes only seemed to sharpen her desperation. One could almost feel it in the air, like static before a lightning strike. The tension in her narrowed eyes as she stood behind her blinds watching us live in the freedom she once suppressed. I figured she'd try something again, but I didn't expect her to resort to third-party sabotage. It happened just after midnight on a Monday. I was half asleep, flipping channels and considering another bowl of cereal when a loud metallic crash shattered the calm. I bolted to the window just in time to see a black pickup truck speeding away and the unmistakable sight of my concrete mailbox lying shattered on the ground, cracked in half like a dropped tombstone. My gut twisted, not because I didn't expect it, but because it confirmed that Karen had finally escalated to outside help. I checked the camera feed and there he was, a large man in work boots and a hoodie stepping out of the truck, swinging a sledgehammer with practiced ease, then fleeing before the lights fully activated. I saved the footage, called the police, and then sat on my porch staring at the ruins like a farmer mourning a destroyed crop. When the officer arrived and saw the wreckage, he didn't need convincing. The footage was clear, the damage evident, and the motive well documented in the increasingly absurd Karen folder. I gave a statement, filed the report, and by sunrise, I'd already begun building a new mailbox, one made of steel, encased in stone, and reinforced like a medieval fortress. The police called the next afternoon. They'd identified the man as a local contractor with a record of property damage disputes. Under pressure, he admitted he'd been paid in cash to break a mailbox that deserved it by a woman fitting Karen's description. When they asked for more details, he claimed he didn't know her name, only that she kept talking about restoring order and saving the neighborhood from anarchists. It was laughable. It was also enough for them to charge him with vandalism and begin investigating Karen for conspiracy. The moment word got out, the neighborhood practically held a celebration. Someone even tied a little get well soon balloon to the remains of the mailbox before I hauled it away. But Karen didn't stop there. Oh no, she doubled down. Within days, she started a PR campaign, or at least what she believed one should look like. She printed flyers with a stock photo of a mailbox engulfed in flames, clearly photoshopped, and the headline, "Is this the future you want?" followed by a dramatic plea for law-abiding neighbors to rise against lawless vigilantes. The flyers were taped to lampposts, porch railings, and even the community bulletin board where kids usually advertised lemonade stands. I took them all down, of course, but not before
snapping a photo and posting it in the neighborhood group chat with the caption, "When you can't control the
HOA, try fear propaganda."
The reactions poured in within minutes.
Laughing emojis, memes. Someone photoshopped Karen's face onto a 1950s doomsday poster.
Her flyer campaign died the next morning.
Things came to a boiling point
a week later when a news crew showed up. I had just returned from the hardware store with more mortar for the new mailbox base when a van rolled up bearing a local network logo and a bright-eyed reporter with way too much
makeup stepped out holding a mic.
She introduced herself, asked if I'd be willing to talk on camera, and I agreed. Under one condition, that they show the footage of the mailbox being destroyed. She smiled and said, "We love a good
villain arc." The interview was surreal. I stood next to my fenced yard and
half-finished mailbox, calmly explaining the events of the past few weeks while Karen watched from across the street, behind her curtain like a vampire avoiding sunlight. I told the reporter I wasn't trying to be a hero, just a man
who believed in boundaries, both legal and personal. They aired the segment. That evening,
Karen was shown in a blurry clip yelling at officers, falling into the koi pond and slipping while trying to stick a letter on her SUV's windshield. The mailbox destruction footage capped it all off like a
punchline.
By the next morning, Karen was famous for all the wrong reasons.
Memes exploded.
One labeled her the mailbox menace with her face superimposed onto a Godzilla body, stomping over tiny mailboxes. Another had her SUV sitting in the garden with the words certified property ornament stamped in red.
But the crown jewel was
a short remix video someone made blending her koi pond fall with a dubstep beat and dramatic commentary.
It had tens of thousands of views by noon. Karen didn't come outside for 2 days after that. But when she finally did,
she came with a clipboard again, as if grasping the illusion of authority could shield her from reality.
She taped a new note to my fence.
It read, "Due to increased tension, you are instructed to
remove all cameras, lighting, and fences surrounding my vehicle or further action will be taken."
I removed the note, scanned it into my records, and sent it straight to Rita.
Her response was short.
"This woman has lost her mind.
I'll file an injunction." That night,
while the sprinklers watered the garden around the SUV, I received a knock at the door. It was a neighbor I hadn't spoken to before, a quiet young woman named Tara, who lived 2 houses down. She held a small plate of cookies and said, "I just wanted to say thank you.
My daughter used to cry every time she saw Karen's dog because Karen would yell if we walked too close to her lawn. She hasn't yelled once in 2 weeks."
I thanked her, and as she walked away, I realized how deep Karen's reign of fear had run.
It hadn't just been about mailboxes or cars.
It had been about people feeling like they didn't belong in their own homes.
Still, Karen's desperation wasn't finished.
She saved her last card for a late-night sabotage that could have caused serious damage.
It was around 2 o'clock in the morning when I woke to an alert. The internet had gone down. My
security system kicked into cellular backup, but something felt off. I stepped outside with a flashlight and followed the path of my cable line, only to find it had been cleanly cut near the garden bed.
Deliberate, precise, and petty.
I checked the cameras, and sure enough, there she was again, crouched in gardening gloves with a pair of snips, slicing the line, and then crawling back to her house like she was part of some
elite Black Ops unit.
I filed another police report.
This time they had enough. With multiple complaints, video evidence, and a pattern of destruction.
They charged her with trespassing and property damage. She was forced to appear in court, where she tried to argue she had every right to access public landscaping. The judge didn't even let her finish before threatening her with contempt.
It was the silence that tipped me off. Not the kind of peaceful silence you earn at the end of a good day, but the thick waiting kind that feels like something has been temporarily muted in. The universe, like the neighborhood, was holding its breath. After the court appearance and the property damage charges, Karen had vanished from view for nearly a week. No late-night pacing. No surveillance from behind her blinds, no crumpled notes shoved under fences. At first, I thought maybe she'd finally accepted defeat, that she'd curled into the shadows to lick her wounds and figure out a quieter way to live among the people she used to reign over. But I should have known better. Karen's ego was a creature that didn't die. It hibernated, and that silence wasn't surrender. It was the pause before the final tantrum. On a bright Thursday morning, just as I was prepping for a virtual interview with a national auto parts supplier looking to expand into residential custom builds, I noticed something odd. My home internet was down. No signal, no blinking light on the router, just a silent dead zone where connection used to hum. At first, I figured it was a service outage. I rebooted, checked the wires, tried not to panic, but then I remembered the last time the internet mysteriously went down. And how I found Karen's garden-gloved hands snipping through my cables like she was pruning roses. I checked the cameras. They had kicked into cellular backup, still rolling, still vigilant. And there it was again. Grainy nighttime footage of Karen creeping around the edge of my yard, crawling on all fours. Like some budget action movie villain. This time with what looked like pliers and a small flashlight clamped between her teeth. She found the main cable junction and snipped it clean, then scurried back across the street like she hadn't just committed yet another felony in high definition. But the real issue wasn't the cut wire. It was the fact that I had a crucial interview in less than 2 hours and no stable internet meant I couldn't risk the video feed dropping mid-sentence. For most people, this would be a crisis. For me, it was a minor hiccup I'd already planned for. I flipped open my backup router, powered it on, watched the signal light blink to life, and ran a quick speed test. Solid. I brushed off my shirt, poured myself a cup of coffee, and logged into the call. 10 minutes early. Calm as a monk at sunrise. The interview went beautifully. I told my story, showcased some prototype parts, even cracked a few jokes about the importance of building things that last longer than 4 mailboxes. They laughed. They liked me. They said I'd hear back soon. As I logged off, I glanced outside and spotted Karen peeking from her window, trying to gauge whether her little sabotage had worked. I smiled and gave her a thumbs up. She slammed the curtain shut so hard I saw the rod shake. That afternoon, I called the police again. It had become a routine at this point. I submitted the new footage, filled out the report, and forwarded everything to Rita, who by now had developed a sort of amused affection for the ever-growing Karen saga. She said this city had finally had enough and would be filing a formal injunction barring Karen from entering within 20 feet of my property line. If she violated it again, she'd be arrested on site. It was almost anticlimactic how quiet things became after that. The fence stood tall, the new mailbox stood stronger, and her SUV still sat imprisoned in the middle of our flourishing community garden, now surrounded by little signs that read names like Hope Parsley and Freedom Tomatoes. I had even added a wooden bench nearby, where neighbors now like to sit, sip coffee, and marvel at how poetic it all was. It was the exact opposite of the sterile, fearful HOA she used to enforce. Now we were just people who happened to live near each other and had finally remembered what that meant. Then came the most ridiculous twist yet. One afternoon, I came home to find a small package on my porch with no return address. Inside was a poorly decorated Tupperware container filled with what I can only describe as the most suspiciously looking cookies I had ever seen. There was a note taped to the lid that simply read, "Peace offering." I didn't need to guess where they came from.
I wasn't about to eat anything that passed through Karen's kitchen, not after what she'd done to my cable line, my mailbox, and my peace of mind.
But I appreciated the audacity.
I tossed the cookies and kept the note, adding it to the growing collection of bizarre Karen
artifacts that now filled an entire drawer in my office.
But what truly broke whatever spell Karen had been
clinging to was what happened next.
The court had ordered her to pay restitution for the damages. And when the total came
through, she balked at the amount.
Over $1,500 in property damage, legal fees, and community service hours. Her lawyer, who I suspect she found on the back of a flyer stapled to a tree, had apparently told her she could argue hardship, but the judge had no patience left. He ruled in my favor and assigned Karen to perform 30 hours of community service in the neighborhood she used to control. That included pulling weeds in the community garden her SUV still occupied. On her first day of service, Karen arrived wearing gloves, a floppy hat, and a grimace so tight you'd think she was chewing lemons through a straw. Neighbors gathered quietly around the edges of their lawns, pretending to water plants or check mail while watching her dig through the soil she
once tried to own. I offered her a bottle of water. She ignored me. I offered her a trowel.
She took it, stared at it, then dropped it like it had burned her.
The highlight came when a child asked her what kind of plant she was working with, and she muttered something about regret. The kid ran off, laughing.
I stayed seated on the bench, sipping tea and listening to the soft crunch of her steps through the gravel path, a sound more satisfying than any apology. By the end of the week, she had finished her hours, but something had shifted.
Her SUV was still there, unmoved and dusty, but she didn't fight anymore.
She didn't tape new notes or call in more contractors or scream
across the street. She just went quiet. One morning, I found her standing near
the garden fence, staring at the archway where someone had added a hand-painted sign that said, "Grow Together."
She didn't speak. She didn't wave.
But for the first time, she didn't look angry. Just tired, and maybe, just maybe, aware of how much she'd lost, not by being challenged, but by refusing to ever be a neighbor.
That night, I lit a small lantern by the mailbox.
A subtle symbol that the war was over and that she could stay on her side as long as she
understood. Peace wasn't something you enforced. It was something you earned.
I don't know if she saw it or if she understood it, but the next morning when I walked out with my coffee, the garden was undisturbed, the mailbox untouched, and the internet cable firmly in place. The neighborhood had changed.
Not because I wanted to be a hero, but because I refused to be a victim.
And now, with Karen faded into the background and the air finally still, it was the first time I truly felt at home. The morning sun cast a golden haze over the community garden as birds chirped with exaggerated cheer. The kind of overly optimistic soundtrack that would usually make me suspicious something bad was coming. But today it just felt like punctuation to a long, strange sentence finally reaching its period. The lavender had exploded with color. The tomatoes were ripening faster than we could pick them, and the wooden archway bearing the words "Grow Together" stood tall and proud, flanked on both sides by a bench and a collection of gnomes donated by neighbors once fined for
having too many.
In the center of it all, like some misfit art installation,
still sat Karen's SUV.
Now sun-bleached and speckled with pollen.
Nobody mentioned it anymore.
It had stopped being a vehicle and become something else entirely, a symbol, a
punchline, a landmark.
Kids called it the fossil.
Visitors asked if it was part of the garden's irrigation system. Someone even stuck a plastic flamingo next to it with a sign that read, "Rest in Peace, HOA."
And through it all, Karen remained mostly invisible. Occasionally, I'd catch her in the window, looking out with that exhausted expression of someone who knows the world moved on without them.
She no longer sent notes or made threats.
Her clipboard had disappeared. Her dog barked less, and though she hadn't apologized, the sheer silence from her corner of the street spoke volumes more than her shouted demands ever did.
But as with all stories, there's always one
last spark before the fire dies for good. It came in the form of a neighborhood flyer.
This time not from Karen, but from Bruce, the new HOA president who everyone liked because he never told anyone what to do and always brought cookies to meetings.
The flyer announced a summer block barbecue, a casual affair meant to celebrate the neighborhood's progress and bring people together.
It would be held in the
community garden, of course, with live music from a local bluegrass trio and a
bouncy house for the kids.
People were encouraged to bring dishes, lawn chairs,
and any lingering grievances they wanted to bury in good food and laughter. The moment I read it, I knew Karen wouldn't be able to resist.
She hadn't been invited directly, but the garden was public now. Her car was still sitting in
the center of it.
There was no way she'd let a party happen around her monument to pride without making at least one
last dramatic appearance.
The barbecue was perfect. Neighbors brought everything from brisket to mango salad. Someone set up a lemonade bar with spiked and non-spiked options.
Kids ran barefoot across the grass, their chalk
drawings adorning the sidewalk like a festival mural. The band started playing just as the sun dipped low.
And for a
brief moment, everything felt impossibly normal.
And then Karen appeared. She
stepped out of her house wearing a sun hat, a long flowing dress that looked like it had been ironed with tension, and a forced smile that held so much effort it could have cracked porcelain.
Conversations paused briefly as she
approached the garden gate, then resumed as if nothing had happened. She walked around the perimeter, eyes darting to every table, every smiling face, every bit of joy that existed without her
permission. And when she reached the fence surrounding her SUV, she froze.
Because the fence had changed. Earlier that morning, I had rebuilt it just slightly, adding one final touch. It wasn't to trap her car any longer. That part had already served its purpose.
No. This time it was decorative.
The new fence was short, made of hand-carved cedar with flower planters attached to
each post and a tiny hand-painted sign hanging in the middle that read "Reserved for Karma." Karen stood there staring at
it for so long that the band shifted into a slower tune without realizing the tension that had returned to the air.
She didn't speak.
She just turned on her heel and walked away, not toward her house, but toward the shed behind it. Moments later, she returned carrying a pair of bolt cutters. At first, I thought it was a joke, some twisted performance art, but she walked right up to the fence, gripped the lock on the
decorative gate, and began to cut.
The snapping sounds silenced the music. Conversations dropped like a switch had been flipped.
Children stopped mid-chalk line.
The smell of barbecue hung heavy
and awkward in the air.
I stood up slowly, my lemonade still in hand, and walked toward her as calmly as I could. She clipped the final hinge, yanked the gate open, and marched to her car like she had just won a court case. Then she stopped. The driver's door wouldn't open. Weeks of pollen, dust, and weather had practically sealed it shut.
She yanked harder. The handle creaked. The
door flung open finally and released a cloud of trapped heat so thick it fogged
her sunglasses.
She sat down anyway defiantly and tried to start the engine. The battery was dead.
Of course it was.
She turned the key again.
Nothing. She
slammed the steering wheel with both fists and screamed so loud it echoed across the lawn and into the woods behind the houses.
That's when the officers arrived. Not because I called them. They were already there, invited to the barbecue like everyone else. Two patrolmen had been enjoying ribs near the lemonade bar and now approached. Calmly, napkins still tucked into their shirts. One of them tapped on the passenger window and asked if she was okay. Karen, red-faced and breathing like a steam engine, blurted out something about private property and imprisonment and sabotage. The officers looked at the crowd, the decorative fence, the open gate, and then at me. I shrugged and said, I told her I'd unlock it whenever she asked. One officer smiled and nodded. The other asked Karen if she had jumper cables. She glared at them like they were part of a conspiracy. The crowd began to disperse slowly, like a theater audience, realizing the show was over, and the curtain wasn't coming back up. I walked away, not out of rudeness, but because there was nothing left to witness. Karen had finally exhausted every angle, every tactic, every last desperate gasp of relevance, and the community had simply outgrown her. Later that night, once the music resumed and the laughter came back, I slipped away to my porch with a fresh glass of lemonade and sat under the warm glow of the porch light. Across the street, Karen's car sat alone. Its door now open, the inside half cleaned out. A pair of jumper cables lay on the ground untouched. Her house was dark. She had finally retreated completely, not just from the garden or the mailbox or the fence, but from the power she once held so tightly. And as I looked out over the neighborhood, alive, vibrant, finally unafraid, I felt something I hadn't expected. Not triumph, not gloating satisfaction, but peace. True, complete, quiet peace.